For the invitation, and we launched the new daily back in 2013. I'll just sketch out what it's about. It's backed by the industry super funds movement, which includes Australian Super, CBUS, HESTA, not-for-profit superannuation funds. They came to me 4 years ago with the idea of getting in on the national conversation because they thought the national conversation was, hi Tom, half the staff's here. The national conversation was a bit one-sided and a bit concentrated in too few hands. And so we launched it with the goal to inform, equip, and equip is a very important part of our philosophy because we think a lot of websites have a lot of information that is kind of almost disposable, and we really wanted to give them stories that they could apply to their daily lives, while at the same time entertaining across the whole spectrum. We're particularly aiming it at working Australians. I mean, so in that sense, it's pitched at middle Australia. Maybe people who go off to work every day and they have to worry about things like paying the mortgage and saving for the annual holiday, and we think that somehow they're being forgotten. We think that the papers that traditionally delivered for working men and women have kind of moved to the right. The Herald Sun's now dominated by Andrew Bolt, the Daily Telegraph's dominated by Piers Ackman and Miranda Devine, and no one's really talking to working Australians. So we think that's a really important area for us. And after just 20 months, we've hit 850,000 monthly uniques, and we've now got 500,000 daily subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed, you should. It's free, and it always will be free. That's our promise. So all of that has meant that we just made the top 40, which we think is a terrific achievement in just 20 months. We never thought it would be easy, but we've been quite struck at how quickly we've gotten into the top 40, given that Nielsen publishes a list every month of more than 200 websites. So I think in our very first survey in December 2013, we were number 140, and now we're number 36. As a journalist and editor, I've sort of had a front row seat at the sort of migration of news from print to online over the past 20 years. In 1996, I was editor of The Age when we launched age.com, and in 2007, I was editor of The Herald Sun when we relaunched The Herald Sun. And so I've sort of watched the migration, and whenever I sort of reflect on it, I think of that joke about the man who walks into a bar with a frog on his head. And the barman sort of looks at him and says, geez, where did you get that? And the frog says, well, I don't know, it sort of started as a pimple on my bum and just grew and grew and grew. And in many ways, that's what's happened with the internet. That the internet started as just sort of this little backwater thing at The Age. I think my first editor had 2 subs, and that was 1996. And bit by bit, it's just grown into where it's taken over the host. The parasite, in a sense, has taken over the host. And I think along the way, newspaper groups have really struggled with that. They've almost stumbled and bumbled their way to success. So when the list came out this week, to me, it looked a bit like this. This is kind of, despite all the hopes, our internet top 40 is still largely Jurassic. It's dominated by the same people who dominated print, which is a bit scary, because my view of the internet when we launched in 1996 was that all these new voices would enter, and big, strong Australian voices, because as we all know, we no longer have the cost of entry. We don't have to buy printing presses, and we don't have to have delivery trucks. It's a relatively simple, low-cost medium. And I thought we'd go from this kind of barren desert, which had sort of the News Limited monolith and the Fairfax monolith, and we'd have this rainforest of fantastically inventive news publishers. But in fact, when you look at the latest list, it's full of sort of people we have been reading for, in my case, for decades. And I worry about that. If you look at that list, there's only 2 outlets on there that didn't really exist before the internet took hold in the mid-90s. And I'll talk to each of them, but one of them is ours at number 36, and the other one is The Conversation at number 38. But pretty much everyone else there existed in print form in Australia or overseas. And I sort of wonder what happened. Why, in 20 years of the leading players stumbling and bumbling, has there been no really strong entrant into that top 40? I mean, there's a few outside the top 40, and for whatever reason, well, for instance, BuzzFeed is not included there, but that started in America. The AFR is in a different category, but you can see that, you know, you've been reading these sites either in print or digital for many years, and I've been reading them for a lot longer. So when you look at it, a couple of things jump out. I think there are three major learnings from this. The first one is that Fairfax and News, for all their mistakes, have successfully migrated online. And believe me, having worked there in a senior capacity at both organisations, they made a lot of mistakes. We pretty much were making it up as we went. And yet here we are. I think News and Fairfax have got 5 of the top 10. They've got, I think it's 9 of the top 20 and 16 of the top 40. So that whole kind of idea that we would sort of end the media concentration dilemma hasn't really worked. And then the other thing that emerges is the rise of foreign media in Australia. Now this is never debated. It's never even remarked upon. But if you look at it, I think they've got even more. They've got 21 of the top 40 foreign sites or foreign joint ventures with local publishers. And on the sort of, if you look at it just sort of transparently, that may be a good thing. We may have more diversity than we've ever had. But given that it's only a couple of years ago that we actually had a law that forbade foreigners owning newspapers, or more than 25% of newspapers, why haven't we even had a debate on this? Why has no one said, is it okay that the Daily Mail is now the 4th most read news site in Australia? The Guardian, is that okay? I mean, it's obviously a better website and it raises the level of public discourse, but, you know, is that a good thing that suddenly, you know, all of our efforts are being sort of squeezed out by these enormously cashed up foreign sites that on one level are preventing sites like ours growing, and on another level are beginning to affect the public debate? So for instance, like the Huffington Post launches next month. That's a Fairfax joint venture. So that'll go into the top 10 as well. So probably if we had this discussion in a month or so, it would be News Limited 1, Fairfax 2, ABC, which I'll come to in a minute, Daily Mail overseas, 9MSN News overseas joint venture, The Guardian overseas, Yahoo 7 overseas joint venture. Probably the Huffington Post will push out one of The Age, The Telegraph or The Herald Sun. So suddenly, is that greater diversity, or is it that we're allowing these sort of foreign titles to come into our country without any really serious discussion of what that might mean, both to local publishers and to the level of sort of public discussion? In the year, let's say in a presidential election year, what position does the Huffington Post take? You know, The Guardian is unashamedly left-wing, but it's British-based. I'd just love to have the discussion. I mean, I'm surprised that no one has even remarked on it. But the really, really sad thing is that there are so few local publishers. So here's an exercise. Let's take out all the foreign-owned titles. So there are the Australian websites. If you take out all the ones that come from overseas, The Guardian, the Daily Mail, the New York Times, CNN.com, that's what we're left with. So there's 19 in the top 40 that are genuinely Australian, and we are suddenly number 17. So on one level, that's pretty cool, but you know, that's all we've got that are Australian, pure Australian voices. Now, let's take out Rupert. So Rupert, you know, accounts for about 8 of those 19 in one way or another. Now we're down to 11, and you can see it's dominated, you know, by Fairfax, the other sort of monolith springing out of the desert. So let's take them out. So here we go. We've got the top 40 websites in Australia. We've taken out the foreigners. who are all legacy media, most of them. They've been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years doing their thing. They've made a lot of money out of print. They've migrated online, and now they're making even more money potentially. We've taken out Rupert, who's dominated the Australian print scene for decades and decades, and we've taken out Fairfax, which, you know, has also had its one half of a very cosy duopoly, you know, News Limited and Fairfax. And we're left with those four, who don't fall into those three buckets. Now let's take out the government-funded sites, and that leaves us. How is that possible? That in 20 months, we have become the #1 independent website in Australia 20 years after I launched the Age website. Someone's asleep at the wheel here. And my concern is that would-be Australian publishers have missed the boat, because it's going to get harder and harder to get in on this than it was in the last 20 years when the big players were fumbling and bumbling their way to success. So it's kind of sobering sort of reading. And I hope that, you know, as students, as young journalists, you think about this and you think, well, maybe one day I should become a publisher. Because you shouldn't just be thinking about being reporters, you should be thinking about becoming publishers, because you can. You don't necessarily have to link up with industry super funds, but, you know, in your own ways, particularly in your communities, I think you're better placed than most to become publishers in your own right. So that's the kind of background and the framework that we're all working in, or will be working in, for the foreseeable future. I thought probably it would be worthwhile to start a conversation in this room about how maybe you can best cope with that and what you'll be doing going forward. How many people in this room are actually working on titles? And how many are studying to work on titles, who are students? Okay, so it's a mix of sort of young journalists and people who want to be journalists. Okay, so look, a lot of this you may know, and I might sound like a boring lecturer or something, I don't know. But we put our heads together in the newsroom of the New Daily, and we thought, for this to be an interesting session, why don't we try to tell you what we've learned in 2 years? Many of us came from print. Many of us came from regionals. Our deputy editor, Patrick Elliott, was the former editor of the Sunraysia Daily. One of our senior writers, Caitlin Thalls, is a former senior writer at the Sunraysia Daily. We've got someone starting next week from the Swan Hill Guardian. We find that regional journalists are fantastic for our site because they're multi-skilled, they're hard-working, and they pick up digital very, very quickly. But these are the things that we've kind of learned. And the first one is obviously, and it's the kind of lesson that we all learned from day one, is that digital is a conversation. It's not a monologue. And in print for years and years as an editor, I didn't even talk to the readers. I mean, quite often I didn't even publish their letters. I mean, I knew so little about the readers that it was kind of scary. But I think in this incarnation, digital, if you don't have the conversation, you're going to die pretty quickly. And the thing is, the great tradition in newspapers was to start conversations. So, you know, I look at the Australian and it's still got the word exclusive, 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 all sprinkled throughout the paper. In a funny way, that's old-fashioned. I'm not suggesting that we stop going after stories that are really new and compelling. But to some extent, all you can hope for in the digital world is to get in on conversations that have already started. If you don't get in on the conversation, you're going to lose a lot of traffic. So remember that first and foremost, it's a conversation.